All right. Can you guys see okay on the screen share? Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Well, thanks for inviting me for this talk. I really appreciate it. I just want to get started by introducing my research group, which is the Bio-Inspired Systems Lab, or BISSL. And we are in mechanical engineering here at Texas A&M. And these are current and former students in our group. And the work I'll be presenting today is thanks to all of their hard work. So today's talk, I'm going to be focusing on what we can learn from nature systems to help achieve waste equals food, and how we can use characteristics from ecosystems in particular to support these sustainable initiatives at the system level. So in my research group, we're very much motivated towards the goals of sustainability and resilience at the system level. And this came about by initially focusing on sustainability, right? The traditional three areas of environmental, economic, and social aspects, and quickly realizing with the increasing number of disturbances occurring that resilience is a kind of key fourth area that really goes hand in hand with sustainability. So considering sustainability and resilience simultaneously is very critical for when we're thinking about designing for current needs and future needs. Right? We can have the most environmentally friendly, economically beneficial, socially positive design, but if it's not going to survive the next disturbance that occurs, it's not a very good design. So what is the value of a systems perspective when we're trying to achieve these sustainability and resilience goals? So our approach takes the position that, when we are searching for economic opportunities, waste reduction opportunities, trying to better retain value, reducing raw material use, that a lot of these opportunities are only available if we take a systems perspective. So you can imagine that, right, if we are taking more of a traditional small scale view of decision making at the supplier level, manufacturer level, distributor, retailer, or consumer, that these decisions are very isolated, and you're really just considering your immediate inputs and outputs and your immediate needs. But when we want to achieve these really systems level goals of sustainability and resilience, we need to take a much bigger systems perspective. So essentially just draw bigger system boundaries. And you can see on the right-hand side, this is essentially the same hypothetical supply chain, but we get so many more opportunities available to us when we take this systems perspective to find ways to reduce waste, to find ways to reduce raw materials, increase value retention inside the system boundaries. Um, and again, all of these cyclic connections that you see here on the right-hand side that are kind of feeding back in, you're not going to be aware of these at that individual actor scale. So taking this systems perspective, you start to quickly realize that complex systems are everywhere, right? The more traditional things that we normally think of systems, things like satellite networks or water distribution networks, but really we can draw anything as a system if we make our boundaries big enough. So we approach these complex systems, right, trying to achieve sustainability and resilience, and we quickly realize that now we have what's known as a complex problem, right? So our goal with our labs research is, how do we better design human networks to reduce cost, increase efficiency, be more resilient, and reduce negative environmental effects? How do we achieve these things? And the approach we take is through bio-inspired design. Right, so bio-inspired design or biomimicry, this is the approach where we seek innovation by looking to nature, right? So we try to mimic or draw inspiration from nature's time-tested patterns and strategies to solve our problems. And in our group in particular, we look at biological ecosystems for this inspiration. So we take a systems level approach even in our inspiration. So these biological ecosystems, they're of interest because they are made up of sustainable processes. They're resilient to unexpected disturbances. They're stable to certain species loss or actor deletions. They have cyclic pathways that are very successful in supporting the system's use of all available value. And specialized species or actors are very well supported by the system. So, right, all of these goals are things that we want in our human networks as well. These are all good things. So our approach, we use ways that ecologists study ecosystems, and we apply that to our human networks to try to, better or to try to achieve these similar goals. So ecologists study ecosystems. One way is using food web network models. And for these models, they're focusing on the predator-prey interactions, and they're focusing on the link structure and how the links connect to the overall behavior of the network. So the analogy we're using here is that the species in our food web are analogous to our actors in our industrial network or our power grid, the components of the grid, or our water distribution network components. And what we see when we do this is that both of the networks, the food web and the human network, have this similar exchange of materials and energy going on. So when we use food webs as inspiration, we're looking for ways that nature might be able to suggest how to be more sustainable and resilient. And our hypothesis, again, is that by promoting these ecosystem-like features, we will cause our human networks to similarly approach these sustainable and resilient states that are characteristic of these biological ecosystems. So one of the techniques we use when we go about this is ecological network analysis, or ENA. This is an approach used by ecologists to quantify the structural patterns and connections between structure and function, to quantify development, to quantify interactions, all of these things in these ecosystems. So the general process that we're mimicking from ENA is, right, selecting your system of interest. So in this case, an ecosystem, selecting your system boundaries, and then determining all the predator-prey interactions or consumer-producer interactions between those actors, as well as crossing the system boundaries. And then we create what's called a directional graph of this network, or digraph, where our actors become our nodes, and those interactions that we were interested in and identifying become our edges or directional connections. And then there's two levels of ENA that we can look at. The first focuses on the intercompartmental links. It's going to create what's called a food web matrix, and it just uses structural information to create this. So the rows are prey and the columns are predators. So the flow is, or the consumption patterns, the energy flows are going from prey, from row to column. So an interaction will be documented as a 1 from actor 1 to actor 2. That'll be in the first row, second column. So 0 means no interaction, a 1 means that there's an interaction. And the next form of ENA uses flow magnitudes for all the exchanges. So it looks at both intercompartmental exchanges as well as flows happening across the system boundaries, so entering or exiting. And so that creates what's called a flow matrix, which you see on the right-hand side here, that captures this flow magnitude information, as well as inputs to the system, exports, and dissipation, or lost value. So I wanted to cover two different ecosystem characteristics today for you guys. The first is ecosystem cycling. And what's interesting is that ecosystems tend to characteristically have a lot of cycling. And this is related to their effective use of materials and energy. So once a material or energy is inside the system boundaries, it is going to stay there until it is almost completely used up, right? So this idea of like needing less raw materials because we are extracting all value possible and therefore producing less waste as well. This cycling that supports effective use of materials and energy is created by detritivores and decomposers. So these are things like earthworms, mushrooms, slugs, fungi, right? These are species in what's called the brown food web, right? And they process low quality materials and energy, right? So this is dead organic matter or detritus. And we can quantify this ecosystem cycling that has all these benefits using just information about the structure of the network. So just, is there a connection, yes or no, and what direction does it go, which again is beneficial from a designer or analyzer perspective because you don't need a lot of detailed information that maybe a company doesn't want to share, which is often a problem. So calculating cyclicity, it can be a value of 0, which means there's no cycling. So this would be like a chain. It can be a value of 1, which means there's weak cycling. So it's present, but it's very basic, or it can be any value greater than 1. So again, cyclicity, it identifies and qualifies our cyclic pathways, and we tend to find very high values when we look at food webs. So the first case study I want to go through is looking at industrial resource networks, right? And this was really motivated by the trend that occurred, really, lots of interest about waste equals food, that idea, my waste is your resource. And there were a lot of industry efforts where they call themselves eco-industrial parks, trying to support this idea of waste equals food. So companies which were interconnected via byproduct and resource exchanges, trying to keep value inside the system boundaries, right? So again, this sounds like what we see in ecosystems, and more specifically, the food web models of ecosystems. But we were interested in if that was actually happening, because this was being applied through very, kind of hand-wavy efforts of just, the trying to achieve the concept anyway. So these industrial resource networks, they are exchanging basic inputs and outputs. They're trying to embody, this idea of closed loop cycling, circular economy. They're trying to limit their raw material consumption and their landfill contributions, reduce their environmental impacts, and increase efficiency. What we saw is that these eco-industrial networks actually did not necessarily work like nature. So that it's not good enough to just say you want to, use waste equals food to design your network. But there's more to it than that, right? If you really want to look like nature. So we found in our research that this had a lot to do with this idea of a detritivore type actor in the network, right? You remember that I showed you that slide that like these detritivore actors, these fungi, earthworms, slugs, these types of species that can process low quality materials and energy that no one else in the network can process, and do it in such a way that it's available for the rest of the system to use. We needed to find these in our industrial networks and make sure that they were active participants in the network. So we came up with this industry definition of an industry actor that's, some kind of waste treatment, recovery, recycling, or agriculture. And it had to be an active participant, so having one connection, enter and leave at a minimum. And we analyzed this large data set we had of all these different industrial resource networks, and we found a wide variation in how many of these active detritivore type actors were present and how they related to the amount of cycling in the network. So what you see here, Kahlenberg Eco-Industrial Park, this is a really famous, successful industrial network, right? They've had a ton of success in terms of reducing water usage, freshwater usage, reducing waste, creating these interactions to try to, instead of producing waste, you're producing a byproduct that's a raw material for someone else. But when we looked at it from this quantitative ecosystem perspective, looking at the cycling, we saw that there were only 2 active detritivore type actors, and actually only one of them was supporting cycling in the network, right? And there were many other candidates for these types of actors, but they just weren't being sort of activated enough to create these cycles. So on the other extreme, we have this French EIP, Pumical-Bazincourt, with over 15 cycles going on, a much higher cyclicity value, right? And this one also only has 2 active detritivore type actors, but they are significantly more involved in the network, a lot more cycling going on. And across our data set of these industrial networks, we saw a range of cyclicity values and a range of active detritivore type actors as well, but a significant portion that just didn't have these actors present. So, we kind of summarize that like quantitatively, these industrial networks do not look like nature, and they could better approach nature if they use these quantitative system guidelines to try to achieve that. And they could, better achieve our sustainability goals, things like that. So using this idea of quantitatively mimicking or being inspired by nature at the system level rather than more qualitatively in name only being inspired, we looked at a carpet recycling network in Atlanta, and we found that we could create an optimization of the network that best mimics ecosystems. So we ended up focusing on a set of 4 ENA metrics. cyclicity being one of them. So that's cycling, how much cycling you have in the network. And what was really interesting was that when we optimize the network for costs and emissions versus optimizing the network to try to be more like nature in terms of these four metrics, we saw very similar cost and emissions results, but a completely different solution, so a different way of getting there. So this started to key us in on the idea that maybe we're gaining a lot of other benefits that we don't yet realize when we're mimicking nature at the system level. So that leads me to this next metric that I wanted to, or characteristic that I wanted to talk to you guys about, which is ecosystem nestedness. So this is a linkage distribution metric from ecology that focuses on where your links are placed in the network, which is a bit unique from other metrics that look at how big your network is or how well connected it is. And it's used in ecology to study extinctions primarily, as well as in mutualistic ecosystems. So things like plant pollinator networks. Plant pollinator networks and other mutualistic ecosystems tend to have very high nestedness. The nestedness can be a value between 0 and 1. And if you look at the bottom right here, you see a nested network versus an anti-nested network. And you can see that nested network, so this one would have a nestedness of 1. You see this hierarchical organization of interaction. So you have one actor connected to everyone else. The next actor is connected to a subset of those, the next one a subset of those, and so on and so forth, versus more of a random distribution of links. And what's interesting from like an engineering perspective is that high nestedness is you're gonna be able to maximize your value extraction for a minimum number of links. And this is really important because often our links are analogous to money, right? It costs money to put these connections in. So the idea, like mimicking the ecological tendency for higher nestedness could potentially improve our resource reuse for a set number of connections, or essentially improve our sustainability for less money. So we investigated this with an industrial water network study. So we were interested in water in particular because when you exchange water, you need to build pipelines. So this is a case where those interactions cost potentially more money than a scenario where you could just ship something via truck or train. Water was of interest because water is a resource where you never really lose value. It just could be find itself in a form that's difficult to use. So, right, you have these different quality levels essentially, but you can always try to clean it. So we came up with a hypothetical realistic water distribution network made up of 9 actors and 70 total possible connections. So 70 different ways you could connect those actors, 5 different qualities of water. And then we held our production consumption requirements for each of the 9 actors constant. Right? So each actor required a certain amount of water and would produce a certain amount of water at different qualities. And then we tested all different types of architectures, so different ways of achieving these production consumption requirements, such that we found 10 different groups of nestedness. So nestedness is a value of 0 to 1, and we split that up into 10 different bins, essentially. So some architectures had values between 0 and 0.1, some had values between 0.1 and 0.2. And for each of those bins, those different architectures, we calculated how much fresh water was needed and how much did it cost, and then tested pipeline disruption responses. And what you see on the left here are the results of this investigation. So we had 2,000 total designs at 10 different nestedness levels. And we found, really interestingly, that when you had a nestedness above 0.7, you had a 50% chance of having your design fall into the lowest freshwater group, right? So knowing nothing else about the system, not caring about how much water you're using, if you just design based on a high consumer nestedness, you're gonna have a 50% chance of choosing a design that was the lowest possible freshwater use, right? This is really powerful sort of early stage design filtration is what we're seeing here. And not only that, you actually had a 99% chance of having a design that fell into the 2 lowest freshwater import groups. So what you see, this red arrow is telling us that as our nestedness increases, we have a higher chance of having lower resource consumption. So the height of these little towers represents how many designs in our investigation with that nestedness value had a certain amount of fresh water, right? So you can see that our y-axis on the left, our x-axis on the left-hand side is our freshwater usage. So all of these designs sort of closer to the right had the lowest amount of freshwater usage. And then same with consumer nestedness, right? The ones closer to 1 are going to have the least amount of freshwater usage. So that's all well and good, we thought, but what about the cost, right? So what happens if water is really cheap or water is really expensive, right? What happens if you live in a place where there's a lot of taxation on freshwater use, or if there isn't? When is this a good idea to suggest using nestedness as a design guideline to someone? And then this along the same lines, what about geographic dispersion? Sharing water might not be such a bad idea if you're next door neighbors, but if you are far, far away and you have to build a really long pipeline that you have to maintain, does this make sense in that case? So that's what you see here on the right is we investigated 9 different scenarios, so 3 different water cost levels from very cheap water on the furthest left, so this was low resource abundance, to very expensive freshwater on the far right, very cheap, low resource abundance, very expensive freshwater, and on the right is high resource abundance, very cheap freshwater. And then the y-axis, we go from very close proximity between actors to very far spread out proximity. And you'll see everything in green, highlighted in green, tells you scenarios where having a high consumer nestedness is economically beneficial, right? So it is going to save you money to have a high consumer nestedness. Everything in red is where it doesn't make sense to use high consumer nestedness as a decision-making guideline for setting up these interactions, because it's actually going to cost you more. And then the one scenario that's not highlighted at the top center there, that is the furthest distribution and a moderate cost or availability. In that case, it didn't make a difference, right? So you're not going to do anything bad economically by using nestedness, but it's also not going to help you out. So this showed us that having high nestedness gives you a more effective freshwater use. It's going to give you benefits at any geographic spread when your resources are scarce, and when resources are cheap or readily available, it's not worthwhile. So again, very beneficial from like a decision maker perspective to have this insight. And then finally, what happens when disturbances occur, right? Because I think this is the other important consideration when industries are talking to each other, talking about having exchanges between each other, because right now they depend on each other. So if something happens to one company, it's going to affect the second company. So we wanted to know, how will these different designs work when systems or conditions are not optimal? So what happens essentially when pipes are broken, when companies go out of business or are down for a week or two? And what we found is that the high nested structures, again, won out, right? They had an improved response during disturbances. So essentially they used less additional freshwater to meet their needs when there were disruptions, random disruptions in the network. So again, really interesting that you gain all of these benefits by mimicking such a basic structural characteristic of the network. So the last characteristic I wanted to mention is ecosystem resilience. So looking at resilience directly. And the fact that this is a thing makes sense because if you think about it, ecosystems have evolved for survival, right? They experience many of the same threats that we do: droughts, floods, fires, invasive species, and they survive, right? The whole goal is survival, and both survival at a species level as well as the overall ecosystem level. And what's been interesting is that ecologists have found that food webs tend to embody a unique balance of redundancy and efficiency in their network in terms of both structure and function. And it's believed that this is the result of a need to be able to grow and develop when things are good, but also survive during, these potentially continuous perturbations that you can't necessarily expect. So the quantification of this ecosystem resilience characteristic uses both structure and flow. So unlike the first 2 characteristics I mentioned, we need to know flow magnitude as well about the interactions in the network. So a bit more information, but you get a lot more out for it. So ecological fitness, or RECO, this is the metric used by ecologists to describe this. And the specific balance between pathway efficiency and redundancy is described by degree of system order, or DOSO. So these metrics can describe 100% pathway redundancy. So that's what we see on the left-hand side here. So basically all connections are possible are being used. Everything's connected to everything. This gives you a degree of system order value of 0 and an R-eco value of 0. The other extreme, so 100% pathway redundancy or efficiency, is our far right-hand side scenario. So this gives you a degree of system order value of 1, and again, an R-eco value of 0. Now, ecosystems tend to fall in what's called the window of vitality. So they tend to cluster in this degree of system order range of about 0.25 to 0.6. So 0.5 would be a perfect balance between redundancy and efficiency. So they cover that balance point, but they tend to favor the redundant side. So closer to 0 on the x-axis is more redundancy. So again, effective resource utilization when there's no disruption happening, but then being adaptable so that you can survive and recover from unexpected disturbances. So this is what is hypothesized to have produced this window of vitality, this unique range that we see in nature. So what happens when we apply this to human networks? So again, we looked at a water distribution network, an industrial water distribution network, and we optimized the network to have our eco value within this window of vitality, right? So to maximize our eco, to be in this range of degree of system order values that we see in nature. And what you see on the right, so we've got the green is our food webs. So you can see where that range lies. And then we've got a traditional version of this network, which is our red outlined diamond. And so that is just focusing on cost. So designing the network to minimize costs. And then we have this triangle outline. This is what where the network falls when we just design it to maximize our eco, right? To try to be at the peak of this curve. And then we actually looked at a scenario where we applied a weight to costs. So we included our eco and cost both in the objective function. We said design the network such that you are trying to have maximize our eco, but also consider costs. And we heavily weighted costs actually. So cost had a weighting of 0.87. So that produced this red circle. And what was interesting is that both the bio-inspired and the combo scenario, we saw benefits in both of those, but the combo scenario saw a lot of the same benefits of the bio-inspired only scenario, but for a lot less money. But at the end of the day, both of these redesigns, these bio-inspired redesigns, cost more than the traditional version. So we ask ourselves, is this extra cost worthwhile, right? Because that's what's going to make the decision at the end of the day. And we determined that by looking at disruptions in the network. So we looked at 4 different connection breakage scenarios, so where something happens to a pipe and it's no longer functioning. And we looked at 3 different actor shutdown scenarios, where one of the actors in the network was essentially deleted from the network, right? It was no longer available. And what we saw is that the bio-inspired versions of the network, both of them, outperform the traditional versions of the network. So essentially, you are saving significant money when you use these bio-inspired designs. So even though it costs you a little more initially to set this up, you actually reap back the benefits if there was a disruption. So for scenarios where you have a network and you're making decisions and being resilient is important to you, right? Maybe you are looking at like a supply chain for insulin, right? So that you have a critical commodity that you want to make sure gets to customers. In that case, spending that money up front might be very much worthwhile to you because you cannot afford to not be able to function if something goes wrong. So the takeaways that I want to leave you all with is that this bio-inspired systems approach offers ways to combine sustainability, economics, and resilience goals. So to achieve all of these, to be able to consider resilience earlier in the design process. So that's what we saw with the nestedness, that we could use this as like a design filtration technique early on in the design to make sure that any designs we were considering already had sustainability and resilience embedded in them. It's showing us ways how to improve human networks to do more with less, right? So how do we more effectively use our resources? And we've been able to relate these bio-inspired solutions to actually to real world issues. So things like geographic dispersion, resource availability, cost, emissions, frequency and severity of disturbances, all of this. Future work that we're looking at systems of systems applications, so even bigger system boundaries. We're looking at including transient modeling, so including time changes in these models, increasing the details of our disruption scenarios, looking at multi-flow networks like cyber physical systems where, unlike water, where everything is water in your model, you maybe have multiple different types of flows happening. And then looking at this idea of a window of vitality, but for specific applications. So for example, would a supply chain have a different window of vitality than maybe a water distribution network? So with that, I would be happy to answer any questions. And thank you all for listening.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Layton, for such an interesting presentation. I learned a lot. I know that I wasn't very brave to apply these networks in my dissertation, but going over it again, I see that it's complex, and then it's something that we can control the complexity about what we choose to focus on. So there's a statement in the comments from Dr. Abdel. He says, "This is very informative. Thank you. I really appreciate the systems approach. I would like to know a bit more about how you decided on the boundaries of the system and the numbers of the actors."
So can you elaborate a little bit more on that question? Is there a specific case study you're asking about?
Yeah, so he's online. He's going to talk.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I am in a train. It is very noisy. But
No,
yeah, thank you so much. This is really very informative. I'm thinking about the actant in the system. In addition to the actors, they are perhaps passive element in the system. Did you kind of carve that out? How did you decide the numbers of the actors? What are the basis for the decision?
So is there a specific case study that I presented that you're asking about, or more in
the water system? The water system.
Okay.
Yes.
So for the water system, for the nestedness stuff, we made a hypothetical realistic. We made it as realistic as possible, but it was a hypothetical network model. So we chose the system size essentially to be something where if we had some complexity and different qualities of water going on, but it was small enough that we would be able to kind of visually understand what was going on in the network as well. So like we weren't just blindly trusting what the code was outputting. But more to answer your question more in general, we don't take this decision of which components of the system to model as an actor. We don't take that very lightly. So we spend a lot of time thinking about that and making sure that we are modeling all the functionally unique actors in the network, so that we're capturing that impact, and also thinking about the sense of like which actors are we worried about disruptions occurring, so making sure we capture those as actors as well. Maybe an example is we look at power grids, and in power grids we do not model the transmission lines as actors. So that's something that we've spent some time thinking about and making sure that the analogy with nature is still held intact. So if you think about a food web, when that interaction that happens between two species, there's nothing aiding that interaction. That interaction happens directly. So whereas a water distribution network, maybe you have a pipeline aiding that. Power grid, you have a transmission line aiding that between actors. So keeping all of that in mind is, I think, very important. So I hope that answers your question. Cool, thanks.
Yeah, so I was thinking about what to ask, and you mentioned the actors. So is there a way that we can make, like if we watch a system and then we can devise some actors to, like you said, optimize the system? Is there anyone that you have done like that?
Can you clarify a little bit more?
Like if you looked at the system, let's say like the Kallenberg that you saw,
yeah,
there was an actor and then it wasn't working as well as the actor in the second system. So is there a way to create or suggest actors and then test to how do I put it now? So if
I
creating
mean,
in terms
yes,
of,
you could try different versions. Like if you're not sure about whether or not to include something as an actor, or right. So essentially, the alternate is you aggregate it with. So each of the actors is some sort of aggregation happening, right? So you've aggregated stuff together. So what level of aggregation you choose, I would say you just have to try out those different scenarios. I don't have a good answer for what is correct. I think it really depends on what you're interested in learning about the system. So what level of aggregation makes sense for you?
And then that will be to some sort of benchmark that we're trying to achieve, a goal that we want to meet, right?
Yeah. So I think it would depend on that.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, these are all questions that we think about a lot. So these are good things.
Yeah. I don't know if any other person has a question or comments.
Well, I appreciated talking to you all, and thanks for inviting me.
All right. Thank you for coming. And it was very, very educative.
Yeah. No, I was happy to do it. And yeah, let's I look forward to continuing to work with you.
All right. Thank you very much.
Okay, take care.
Bye. Take care.